Holden Prescott had run the port of Portland for 9 years. Not a single ship docked without him knowing what it carried. Not a single signal left his territory without him knowing its source. He controlled everything from shipping schedules to every face that passed through the port gates. Until Nolan, his right hand, the only person allowed to walk into his office without knocking, pushed through the door at 11 o'clock at night, face drained of color, clutching a medical report. Nolan was not a man who lost his composure easily. He had once sat perfectly still with 3 guns pointed at his face. But that night, his voice was different. "You need to see this. Right now." The report landed on Holden's desk. A routine health screening of a night shift dock worker, a woman named Jolene Ward. Buried inside the results was something no one could explain. An electronic signal transmitting from inside her body. Continuously, for the past 3 weeks, sending data to an address that no one in the Prescott organization recognized. Jolene Ward, 27 years old, cargo loader. No family, no criminal record, was carrying something inside her that she had no idea existed, and it was sending data out. If this story made it impossible for you to look away, please like and share it so more people can hear it. Subscribe to our channel so you won't miss the next stories, because there are stories you only need to hear once, but they stay with you for a very long time. Holden read the report once. He didn't read it a second time. He didn't ask any more questions. He folded the stack of papers, set it down on the oak desk, and pressed 2 fingers lightly against the edge of the pages, as though he were sealing a sentence that hadn't yet been spoken. Then he looked at Nolan. "Where was that signal sent?" Nolan shook his head. "We haven't identified it yet. The receiving server is outside our system. I need more time." Holden nodded once. "Then find it." It wasn't a request. It wasn't a suggestion. His voice was as flat as the surface of water before a storm. And Nolan understood that every hour that passed without an answer was an hour he shouldn't make Holden repeat himself. Nolan stepped out. The door closed. Holden remained alone in the office on the 12th floor, where the harbor lights cast slow streaks across the ceiling from the docks below. He didn't look out the window. He looked at the report. The name Jolene Ward sat in the upper left corner of the first page, printed in black ink on white paper, and it meant nothing to him. Not yet. The next morning, Holden had a meeting at 9 o'clock. The man sitting across from him was Ray Loomis, 54 years old, a Northern Route shipping partner who had done business with Prescott Maritime for 7 years. Loomis had a habit of tapping his fingers on the tabletop when he talked, a steady rhythm Holden had heard for 7 years, long enough to know that when the tapping came faster than usual, Loomis was hiding something. Today the tapping was faster. Holden didn't rush. He poured water into a glass, pushed it toward Loomis, then settled back in his chair. "Ray." His voice was gentle, almost friendly. "Is there something you'd like to tell me?" Loomis looked at the glass of water, looked at Holden, looked back at the glass. "No, nothing at all." Holden nodded slowly, the kind of nod from a man who had known the answer before he asked the question, and was only giving the other person one last chance, a chance the other person wasn't smart enough to take. "All right." He turned to Nolan, who was standing beside the door. "Close all of Mr. Loomis's shipping accounts. Cancel the Northern Route contract. Revoke his port access. Effective immediately." Loomis opened his mouth. Holden had already stood. He didn't look back. He didn't need to. The meeting lasted less than 4 minutes. 24 hours later, Ray Loomis lost everything. Not because Holden hated him, but because Holden had asked, and Loomis had chosen to lie. In Holden Prescott's world, that was the one offense that didn't get a second chance. Nolan later told the new people in the organization, "He never asks twice. The first time is the chance. There is no second time." That afternoon, Holden sat alone in his office. The Loomis matter was finished, clean as a knife cut, leaving no splinters behind. But on his desk, the medical report still lay there, still open to the first page, still with the name Jolene Ward printed in black ink. He pulled the stack of papers closer, not because he cared about this girl. Holden Prescott didn't care about anyone he didn't yet have a reason to care about. But someone was operating a signal-transmitting device right inside his harbor territory. Someone was sending data out, and he didn't know where it was going, who it was going to, or what was being sent. And in the 9 years he had run the Portland harbor, that had never happened. Holden set the report down. He looked through the thick glass toward the docks. Somewhere below, in loading area number 4, A girl of 27 was hauling cargo, unaware that something inside her body was broadcasting, and unaware that the man sitting on the 12th floor had just decided to find out why. It took Nolan 48 hours to turn over everything that could be turned over on Jolene Ward. The result sat in a file so thin it was almost an insult, because 27 years of a human life shouldn't have fit into just 12 pages. Jolene Ward, born in Bend, Oregon, no father listed on her birth certificate. Her mother died when she was 19, and from that point on, her records became a chain of temporary addresses. She came to Portland alone soon after, with no money, no relatives, and not a single phone number to call when trouble found her. From 19 to 27, she had worked 11 different jobs, all of them manual labor, all of them in places where people didn't ask what your past was, only whether you showed up on time. At present, she lived in a studio apartment 4 streets from the harbor, just large enough for 1 person and 1 dog. The dog was a Neapolitan Mastiff named Duke, weighing nearly 60 kilos, his face full of folds, blind in 1 eye. She had picked him up at a scrapyard near the harbor 4 years ago. Nolan added 1 more line at the end of the personal profile section. Subject transferred to the main harbor night shift 3 weeks ago. Before that, she worked at the outer warehouse in Sector C, outside the coverage range of Prescott's security scanning system. 3 weeks, exactly 3 weeks, matching the moment the system had first caught the strange signal. She hadn't brought that signal with her. The signal had always been inside her. It was just that before, she had been working somewhere no one could hear it. The second part of the report was what made Nolan read it twice. The signal from Jolene's body was sending data to a server at an IP address registered under the name Meridian Health Solutions. Nolan looked it up. Meridian Health Solutions had closed on paper 7 years earlier. Its business license had expired. Its office had been returned. Its staff had been dissolved. But the server was still running, still receiving data, still operating as though the company had never closed at all. Someone was still paying to keep that server alive. Someone was still reading what it received. And then Nolan found the thing he wished he hadn't found. In Meridian's old financial records, there was an initial investment routed through 3 layers of intermediary companies. Nolan peeled them back 1 by 1. The first layer was a small medical investment fund in Nevada. The second layer was a pharmaceutical consulting company that had already been dissolved. The third layer, the final one, led to a name Nolan stared at for a long time before closing the file. Jerome Watt, the deputy of Prescott Maritime. The man in charge of the entire unofficial pharmaceutical side. The man who had sat at the same table with Holden for 12 years. Nolan brought both parts of the report to Holden's office that evening. He placed the Jolene Ward file on the desk first, then set the Meridian file on top of it. Holden read the Jolene section without expression. He read the Meridian section without expression too. But when he reached the line bearing Jerome Watt's name, his finger stopped on the page. Only for 1 second. Then he turned to the next page. "Don't touch Jerome yet," Holden said. His voice didn't change. "Keep digging." Nolan nodded. Then he added, "And the girl, Jolene Ward. The signal is still transmitting from her body every day. If we move her out of the main harbor zone, the signal will leave our scanning range. But at least she won't be standing in the middle of Prescott territory anymore." Holden looked at Nolan. "Leave her there." "Are you sure?" "If we move her, whoever's receiving the signal will know we found it. And when they know, they'll change the communication method, change the server, change everything. We'll lose the trail." He stood, then walked toward the window. "She stays there. The signal keeps transmitting. And we trace that signal back to its source." Nolan understood. He wasn't moving Jolene for her safety. He was keeping her there because she was bait. And in Holden Prescott's world, bait didn't need to know it was bait. Holden went down to the harbor for the first time on a Wednesday night, close to midnight, when the night shift was halfway through, and loading area number 4 blazed under the glare of industrial lights. He went with Nolan. But Nolan stopped in the parking lot 50 meters away, leaning against the side of the car, watching from a distance with the habit of a man who had grown used to protecting his boss without needing to stand right beside him. Holden walked into the harbor alone. He wore a dark coat and carried nothing with him, except his eyes and a reason he told himself belonged entirely to work. He had come to observe the source of the signal. Nothing more. The night shift loading area had about 15 people, mostly men, moving between containers and forklifts, with the steady rhythm of those who had done this work long enough for the body to run on its own, without the mind having to command it. Holden stood at the edge of the lit area, where the light began to fade into darkness, and he watched. No one looked his way. No one noticed there was a stranger there, except one person. Jolene Ward was pushing a cargo cart from the direction of container number 7 when she stopped. Not completely stopped, just a slight slowing in her steps, enough for her to turn her head toward the darkness where Holden stood. Her eyes weren't frightened. They weren't overly curious. She looked at him the way a stray cat looks at a stranger stepping into the alley where it's sleeping. A look that noticed, assessed, and decided there was no need to react yet. Then she turned back and kept pushing the cart. Holden stood there a little longer. Then he walked over. He didn't know why he walked over, instead of turning back to the car. Later, he wouldn't be able to explain it either. And he wasn't the kind of man who wasted effort explaining his own actions. He stopped a few steps away from Jolene. "I'm Holden." She looked at him. Not at his coat, not at his shoes, not trying to guess who he was. Just his face. "Jolene." "I know." He said it, then realized it sounded strange, but didn't correct it. "You're not afraid? Working the night shift alone?" Jolene tilted her head slightly, the kind of tilt from someone deciding whether the question was worth answering seriously. "I slept outside the bus station for 3 straight months when I first came to Portland. Compared to that, this harbor is like a hotel." She said it in a flat voice, without smiling, without sadness, without asking for pity, the way someone might say the weather was a little cold today. Just a fact, with no emotion attached for the listener to deal with. Holden didn't answer right away. He looked at her for another beat, longer than normal between two strangers, then nodded and turned away. On the way back to the car, Nolan asked, "What did you see?" Holden opened the car door and got in. "She saw me before I saw her." Nolan didn't comment. Holden looked out toward the harbor through the car window. Not many people can do that. A few days later, Holden was at the harbor again. This time it wasn't at night, but late in the afternoon, just as the night shift had begun taking over. He stood on the second-floor walkway of the operations building, where the entire loading area could be seen below. Nolan stood beside him. Down below, crane number 3 was moving a container from the ship to the holding area. Holden wasn't looking at the crane. He was watching Jolene working below, about 15 meters from the container. Then came the sound of metal breaking. No one had time to react. The container lock system malfunctioned, the retaining hook snapped open, and the steel box weighing several tons slipped from the crane. It fell. Everyone ran. Holden saw that Jolene didn't. She turned, saw a male coworker, at least 1.5 times bigger than she was, standing directly in the fall zone, his foot caught in the rail on the ground. She lunged toward him. Both hands grabbed the man's shirt, and she pulled with the full weight of her body. The man broke free from the rail. Both of them fell backward. The container slammed into the concrete less than 2 meters from them, the sound of steel striking concrete roaring across the harbor, shaking all the way up to the second-floor walkway where Holden stood. Dust flew, people shouted, alarms screamed. Holden looked down. Jolene was sitting up. She checked her coworker first, rolled him over, asked if he was all right, waited for him to nod, and only then looked down at her own forearm. A small shard of metal, thrown loose when the container struck, had sliced a long cut across her right forearm. Blood ran down to her wrist and dripped onto the concrete. Jolene looked at the wound, frowned, not because it hurt. She frowned because it was annoying. The way a person frowns when realizing they forgot to bring an umbrella on a rainy day. Holden stood on the walkway, his whole body motionless. Nolan stood beside him, followed the direction of his eyes, and looked down at Jolene sitting in the dust with her bleeding arm, and a face that showed only mild inconvenience. "Don't." Nolan said it softly, but clearly. "You know what happens when you care about someone." Holden didn't look at Nolan, didn't answer. He left the walkway, went down the stairs, and walked straight toward the harbor medical room. Dr. Warren Oakes had been the Prescott family doctor for 20 years. He had stitched wounds at 3 o'clock in the morning, signed death certificates without asking the cause, and seen things an ordinary doctor would need an entire lifetime to forget. At 55, Oakes no longer had the capacity to be surprised by anything, or at least he thought so. Until Jolene Ward sat on the examination table in the harbor medical room with her right forearm bleeding, and her face as calm as if she were waiting for someone to call her coffee order. Oakes washed the wound, disinfected it, and put in 3 stitches. Jolene didn't wince, didn't pull her hand back. She watched him work with a mild curiosity, the way someone watches a mechanic change a tire, interested but not worried. "How many days until it heals, doctor?" Oakes knew the real answer. He had read the preliminary scan results from her previous routine examination, had seen the unusually high tissue regeneration markers. With this body, the wound would close faster than it would on anyone he had ever examined. But he didn't say that. 1 week, keep it clean. While Jolene sat waiting for the bandage to dry, Oakes did something that, technically speaking, fell outside the scope of treating a forearm wound. He used a handheld scanner, the specialized kind Holden had equipped the Harbor Medical Room with, and scanned along Jolene's spinal area. The reason he gave was that he needed to check whether the fall from pulling her coworker had affected her back. Jolene didn't ask anything more. The result appeared on the screen within 90 seconds, and Oakes read it once. Only once. He didn't need to read it again because he had suspected it from the previous examination. And now that suspicion had been confirmed by data so clear it made his blood run cold. A biological device, 3 millimeters in size, was attached to nerve tissue near the spine. It wasn't only transmitting a signal outward, it was operating internally. The device was releasing a tiny amount of a compound that stimulated tissue regeneration, increased bone mineral density, and raised the nervous system's response threshold to pain signals. In other words, someone had implanted something inside Jolene Ward's body that was not only tracking her, but also changing her from within. And it had been doing that for 8 years. "Have you ever had any serious injuries before?" Oakes asked, his voice normal, his hand still taking notes. Jolene thought for a moment. "Broken ribs, when I was 20. Lifted cargo the wrong way. Hurt like hell, but it healed fast. The doctor back then was surprised too." She gave a slight shrug. "I'm lucky. My body holds up pretty well." Oakes nodded, wrote down a few more lines, then told her she could go. Jolene hopped down from the examination table, flexed the arm that had just been bandaged, nodded her thanks, and walked out the door. She walked with the steady steps of someone who would go right back to work after leaving the medical room, not the steps of someone who had just been told something terrible, because she didn't know. She truly, completely, didn't know. Holden was standing in the hallway when Jolene stepped out. She saw him, gave him a slight nod the way she had done at the harbor before, then kept walking. She didn't ask why he was there, didn't seem curious, as if his presence outside the medical room at 10 o'clock at night were the most normal thing in the world. Once Jolene disappeared around the bend in the hallway, Oakes opened the examination room door and looked at Holden. No invitation, none needed. Holden stepped inside. Oakes turned the screen for him to see. "She's the healthiest worker I've ever examined in this harbor. Bone density is 30% higher than average. Pain tolerance exceeds the standard range. Tissue recovery speed is abnormally fast." He paused. "But it isn't natural. The device inside her is interfering. It has integrated with her nervous system. If we remove it, I don't know how her body will react. She may be fine, or her nervous system may go into shock." Holden looked at the screen, looked at the numbers, looked at the scan image of the spinal area, with one small point brighter than the rest, tucked neatly among the nerves, as if it had been born there. "So she's trapped with it?" Oakes sat back in his chair, took off his glasses, wiped them, then put them on again. It was his habit when he was preparing to say something he had already thought through carefully. For her, it isn't being trapped. It's normal. She doesn't know her body is different. She thinks she's lucky. Thinks she can endure more than most people. Thinks her bones heal fast because she's young and healthy. He looked at Holden. "It's only a problem to us." Holden said nothing more. His hand closed around the edge of the examination room door, gripping it harder than necessary, then let go. He stepped out into the hallway and walked toward the stairs. Oakes watched him go. In 20 years of serving the Prescott family, he had learned that when Holden gripped something tightly and then released it without speaking, it meant he was holding back a reaction he wasn't ready for anyone to see. 1 week after the container incident, Holden went down to the harbor again. This time, he didn't stand in the darkness or on the second-floor walkway. He walked straight down to the dock behind the loading area, where the night shift had just ended and the last workers were slowly filing out. He didn't tell Nolan where he was going, but Nolan knew, because Nolan always knew, and he followed at a distance of 20 meters behind him, far enough not to hear anything, close enough to see everything. Jolene was sitting on the edge of the dock, her legs hanging above the black water. Beside her, or more exactly below her, Duke lay sprawled across almost the entire patch of concrete around her. The Neapolitan Mastiff, weighing nearly 60 kilos, took up space like a breathing stone. His wrinkled face folded into heavy layers, one eye permanently closed, the other half lidded. His head rested on Jolene's shoe, a head half the size of her body, and he slept with the absolute trust of a creature that had decided this woman was home. Holden came closer. Jolene heard his footsteps, turned back, and recognized him. She wasn't surprised. She didn't stand. She only shifted slightly to the side, as if making room, though no one had invited him to sit. Holden sat down on the edge of the dock, about an arm's length from her. Duke opened his remaining eye, looked at him lazily, then closed it again. Assessment finished. No interest. For a long while, no one said anything. The sound of water lapped against the dock supports. The sound of boat engines drifted from far away. Then Holden asked, because he wasn't good at sitting in silence with another person without a purpose. "Your dog." Jolene looked at Duke. "Duke. He's big. 60 kilos. Maybe more. I can't weigh him. He won't stand still on the scale." She said it in the voice of someone used to explaining her dog. "I found him at the scrapyard near here. 4 years ago. Back then, he was so thin, nothing but bones and skin, his face covered in old scars, and one eye already blind." She placed her hand on Duke's head, her fingers stroking along a long scar on the bridge of his nose. Everyone was scared of him because of his face. Nobody at the rescue would take him. People looked at that wrinkled face, looked at the blind eye, looked at a body that big, and said no. She stopped. Not because she was emotional. She stopped because she was thinking about how to say it right. "But he's never bitten anyone. 4 years. Not once. He just needed a place to lie down without being chased away." Duke sighed in his sleep, a deep, heavy sigh that made Jolene's shoe tremble slightly. She smiled down at him, the kind of smile people save for the only thing in the world they're completely sure of. Holden looked at the dog, looked at Jolene's hand on his head, looked at the way the 60-kilo animal curled himself around the dirty shoes of a dock worker, as if that were the safest place in the world. Then he stood. He didn't say another word. Didn't say goodbye. Didn't explain. He turned his back and left, his steps long and even, heading toward the parking lot, toward Nolan, who was leaning against the side of the car waiting. Nolan saw Holden's face when he passed through the yellow light of the last street lamp at the end of the dock. He didn't ask. Not because he was afraid, but because there are expressions that, if you ask about them, force the other person to explain something they haven't yet understood, and Nolan had followed Holden long enough to know when to stay silent. Later, much later, after everything had happened and ended in a way no one had seen coming, Nolan told someone in the organization about that night. He said, "I followed him for 10 years. I'd never seen him walk away in the middle of a conversation. He was always the one who ended things, always the one who said the last line, the one who stood first, the one who decided when a conversation was over." That night, she ended it. At the dock, Jolene watched Holden leave. She didn't call after him, didn't wonder aloud. She only watched his shadow grow smaller in the yellow light at the end of the dock, then looked down, stroked Duke's ear, and whispered something to him in a voice only the dog could hear. Duke nuzzled his nose into her shoe and breathed steadily. The water tapped softly against the dock supports, and the night went on, as if nothing had just changed. Nolan brought the final report to Holden's office on a Thursday evening, 3 days after the night at the dock. He didn't knock, because he never knocked. But this time he stopped at the threshold longer than usual before stepping inside. Holden noticed that hesitation. He noticed because in 10 years, Nolan had never hesitated before anything, not even the worst news. "Say it." Nolan placed the file on the desk. It was thicker than the previous ones. He didn't sit. "Jerome Watt is the investor behind Meridian Health Solutions." Holden didn't look at the file. He looked at Nolan. "Go on." Jerome used Prescott's gray pharmaceutical channels to move supplies for a man named Philip Hargrove, the man running the illegal medical research program that Meridian was built to cover. The supplies included biological devices, experimental pharmaceutical compounds, and tracking equipment. All of it moved through Prescott containers, through Prescott Harbor, through Prescott's shipping system, for years. Nolan stopped. Then he said the final part. "And Jerome knows you're investigating." One of the people I questioned while tracing Meridian reported back to Jerome. 2 days ago, Jerome contacted Hargrove's people right after he found out. Holden looked down at the file on the desk. He reached for it, opened it, and turned through a few pages. The copy of the financial transactions between Jerome and Meridian lay on the 4th page, as clear as a sentence being handed down. Every number, every date, every transfer recorded in black ink on white paper. Jerome Watt, the deputy in charge of the gray pharmaceutical side, the man who sat at Holden's right hand in every meeting, the man who poured Holden's drink on Christmas Eve, the man who knew the safe code in this office. Holden closed the file. Very slowly, page by page, he set it down on the desk, pressed his palm flat over the cover as if smoothing a shirt. Then he spoke, and his voice wasn't louder than the sound of paper folding. 12 years, Nolan. Nolan stood by the door. He didn't look away. I know. Call Jerome in. Tomorrow morning. Exactly 8 o'clock. Nolan nodded and stepped out. He didn't ask anything more. There was no need to ask. That night, Holden stayed in the office. He didn't call anyone. Didn't read the file again. He sat in his chair, looking out the window, watching the harbor lights reflected on the black water below. 12 years wasn't a number. 12 years was 12 Christmases. Thousands of meals at the same table. Phone calls at 3 o'clock in the morning when things went wrong. Trust built from time. The kind you couldn't buy and couldn't get back once it was lost. And Jerome had sat at the same table with him through all of it, pouring water, laughing at the right moment, nodding in the right places, while underneath that table, he had been moving supplies for a man who implanted chips into the bodies of people nobody noticed. The next morning, exactly 8 o'clock, Jerome walked into the meeting room on the 12th floor. Holden was already seated. There was nothing on the table except a cup of coffee and a stack of papers turned face down. Nolan wasn't in the room, only Holden and Jerome. Jerome sat down. He still tapped his fingers on the tabletop out of habit. But today the rhythm was slower, and his eyes flicked to the face-down papers on the table more than once. Holden took a sip of coffee. Then he turned the papers over, faced them toward Jerome, and pushed them lightly across the table. Copies of the financial transactions. Jerome looked at the papers, looked at the first page. The tapping of his fingers stopped. He didn't turn to the second page. He didn't need to. The first page was enough. He understood. Holden looked at Jerome the way he had looked at Ray Loomis a few weeks earlier. But it was different. With Loomis, that gaze carried the cold disappointment of a man discovering an incompetent partner. With Jerome, that gaze carried no disappointment. It carried nothing at all. It was empty, and that emptiness was more frightening than any anger. "You have 6 hours to leave Portland," Holden said. "After 6 hours, I can't control what happens to you." Jerome didn't beg, didn't explain, didn't apologize. He looked at Holden one last time. The look of a man who understood that everything that could be said was meaningless, and everything that couldn't be said had already come too late. Then he stood and walked out of the room. The door closed. Holden sat in the empty meeting room. The coffee cooled slowly on the table. The stack of papers still lay on the other side, where Jerome had been sitting. Closed the door. Nolan heard him from the hallway. He closed the meeting room door. Then he stood there, standing in the hallway, his back against the wall, arms folded across his chest, eyes lowered to the floor. Inside the meeting room, there was no sound, no chair scraping, no footsteps, no cup being set down on the table. Only the silence of a room where someone was sitting alone with 12 years that had just been folded into a stack of paper. Nolan stood there for 15 minutes, 20 minutes, half an hour. He didn't knock, didn't ask. He only stood there and waited, and for the first time in a very long time, he didn't know who the person inside would be when the door opened. On the same night Jerome left Portland, Nolan received a call. The caller was one of Prescott's people responsible for monitoring the area around the harbor, the kind of person whose job was to know everything that happened within a radius of a few kilometers, without anyone having to tell him. The man kept it brief. Someone had entered Jolene Ward's studio while she was at the harbor working the night shift. The door had been opened. Inside, there were signs of disturbance, and the dog was no longer in front of the door. Nolan didn't call Holden right away. He drove to the studio first. He needed to see it with his own eyes before reporting, because there are kinds of news that, if you report them wrong, you create panic for nothing, and there are kinds of news that, if you report them right, you need to be certain you're right. He arrived. The studio door was slightly open. Inside, the small room looked the way it always did. The folding bed, the tiny kitchen, the spare shoes in the corner, Duke's leash hanging from the hook beside the door, but the room felt larger than usual. Not because anything had been moved, because something was missing. Missing were the 60 kilos curled on the kitchen floor every night. Missing was the heavy breathing from the corner of the room. Missing was the enormous wrinkled head resting on the dirty shoes beside the door. Duke was lying on the kitchen floor. Nolan saw him before he saw anything else. The Neapolitan Mastiff lay on his side, his head pointed toward the door, as if the last thing he had done was try to stand between the door and whoever had come in. He wasn't moving. Nolan looked at Duke, looked at the kitchen floor, looked at the way the 60-kilo dog lay there, quieter than anything weighing 60 kilos had any right to be, and he understood there was nothing more to check. He stepped outside, called Holden. Nolan didn't say much. He said, "Someone went into her place tonight. The dog tried to stop them. He's gone." Holden listened. There was no sound on the phone for a few seconds, the kind of few seconds that, if you count them, are only 3 or 4. But if you're on the other end of the line waiting, feel as long as a lifetime. Whose order? Jerome contacted Hargrove's people 2 days ago, before you called Jerome into the meeting room. The order was sent before Jerome knew he'd been exposed. Holden understood. Jerome hadn't targeted Jolene because he knew Holden cared about her. Jerome didn't know that. Jerome had targeted her because she was the easiest target. Someone who lived alone, with no one protecting her, no one checking on her. A night shift dock worker with a dog. That was how Jerome sent his message to Holden. "I know you're digging, and I can touch anyone inside your territory." The fact that the person touched happened to be Jolene, the woman Holden had sat beside on the dock, the woman he had listened to as she told him about the one-eyed blind dog nobody wanted. That hadn't been Jerome's plan. It was coincidence, and that coincidence weighed more than any plan ever could. Nolan said later, much later, "I'd never seen him like he was that night. I'd seen him lose money, seen him betrayed, seen him face things that would keep an ordinary man awake for months. But that night was different. The kind where you know something has just broken inside, and the person is still standing straight, still speaking, still giving orders. But something has broken, and it'll never be the same again." Holden said 2 words to Nolan. "Find Jolene. Now." When Jolene came home after the night shift, she opened the door and called Duke's name the way she always did. There was no sound of claws tapping across the floor as he ran out to greet her, no enormous heavy head shoving against her legs. She stepped into the kitchen. She saw Duke. She sat down on the floor beside him, placed her hand on his head, on the familiar wrinkles, on the long scar along the bridge of his nose that she had stroked thousands of times. She called his name. Once, twice, then she didn't call anymore. Duke's leash still hung from the hook beside the door. No one held it. And the small studio 4 streets from the Portland harbor, for the first time in 4 years, was so wide it was unbearable. Nolan found Jolene before Holden arrived. She was sitting in front of the studio door, on the concrete step, close to 4 o'clock in the morning. She didn't go back inside. Nolan understood why. Inside was something she didn't want to see one more time tonight. He called Holden, gave him the address, then stood 30 meters away beside the car and waited. Holden arrived within 15 minutes. He stepped out of the car, looked at Nolan, looked toward Jolene sitting beneath the cloudy yellow glow of the streetlight, then walked toward her. Nolan didn't follow. Jolene sat with her knees drawn up, her back against the door that had been pulled shut. In her hands was Duke's leash, the old leather leash she had taken from the hook beside the door before stepping outside. She wrapped it around her fingers, unwound it, wrapped it again, unwound it again, in a steady, unconscious rhythm, like someone holding on to the last thing left of something that no longer existed. She wasn't crying. Her eyes were dry. Her face was calm, but it was the kind of calm that, if you looked closely, you'd see wasn't peace, but the control of someone holding everything inside by sheer will, because if she let go even a little, she wouldn't know how to gather herself back together. Holden sat down on the step beside her, half an arm's length away. He said nothing. Not because he was choosing his words, not because he was controlling the situation, but because he truly didn't know what to say, and for the first time, he didn't pretend that he did. They sat like that for a while. The sound of trucks passing somewhere in the distance, the faint hum of the streetlight above them. Then Jolene spoke. Her voice was flat, but flat in a different way. Not the voice she had used when talking about the bus station, or when telling him about Duke at the dock. This was the voice of someone saying every word very carefully, because she knew that if she spoke faster, or said more, her voice would break. Someone has been watching me. I've felt it for weeks, and you knew that. It wasn't a question. It was a statement. Holden stared straight ahead and didn't look at her. Yes. Jolene nodded slowly, the kind of nod from someone who had just heard confirmation of what she already knew, but still needed to hear it from another person's mouth for it to become real. My dog. She stopped. Her fingers tightened around the leash. Because of you. Because someone wanted to send you a message, right? Yes. No defense. No explanation. No, I didn't know beforehand. No, I didn't want this to happen. None of the things powerful people usually said when the consequences of that power fell onto someone else's head. Just one word. Yes. Jolene looked at him. For the first time that night, she turned her face fully toward him, and there was no anger in her eyes, no hatred, no fear. There was something worse than all of those things. There was clarity, the clarity of someone who had seen through every layer and had nothing left to guess. Then you owe me the truth. All of it. Not half. Not the version you think I can handle. All of it. Holden looked at her. In his world, no one demanded the truth from him. People demanded money, contracts, protection, favors. No one demanded the truth, because no one believed he would give it, and no one wanted to receive it, if he truly did. Jolene was the first, and she demanded it, while sitting on a cold concrete step, her hand wrapped around the leash of a dog who was gone, her eyes dry, her voice steady. He told her everything, from beginning to end, who he was, what Prescott Maritime really was, the chip inside her body, Meridian Health Solutions, Philip Hargrove, the illegal research program, Jerome Watt, all of it. He hid nothing. Jolene listened without interrupting. She sat still, the leash wrapped around her fingers, her eyes fixed straight ahead, and she listened like someone reading her own sentence without being allowed to look away. When Holden finished, she didn't react right away. 1 minute passed. Maybe 2. Then she spoke, and her voice didn't break. But it was thinner now. So thin it was almost transparent. So, from the beginning, I was just a signal on your security screen? Holden didn't turn his face away, didn't try to soften it. At first, yes. And now? Now. No. Jolene nodded. Not forgiveness. Not refusal. She only acknowledged it, the way she acknowledged everything else life placed before her, with the quiet acceptance of someone who had learned that reacting strongly didn't change the truth. It only made you more tired. I need time. Holden stood. He stayed there another beat, looking down at her, wanting to say something, but knowing that anything he said now would sound like an excuse or comfort, and she didn't need either. He walked away. Before he left the pool of streetlight, Jolene said one more thing. Her voice was small, but every word was so clear it cut through the night air like a blade through paper. You know, the worst part isn't that you hid it from me. The worst part is that for 8 years, someone has been inside my body, and I didn't know. And I thought everything I could endure was because I was strong. Holden stopped. His back was turned to her. He didn't look back. He stood there for 3 seconds. 4 seconds. Then kept walking, and his footsteps were heavier than when he had arrived. 3 days passed without Holden hearing anything from Jolene. He didn't contact her. Didn't send Nolan to check on her. Didn't send anything. He left her there, in the studio 4 streets from the harbor, with the emptiness Duke had left behind, and the truth he had laid down on the concrete step that night. And he waited. He waited not because he was patient. Holden Prescott wasn't patient. He waited because she had said she needed time, and this was the first time in his life he had given anyone time without attaching conditions to it. On the 4th day, Nolan walked into his office and said, "Jolene Ward called the harbor switchboard. She wants to see you." Holden arrived at the studio at 7 o'clock in the evening. She opened the door for him. The room was cleaner than the last time he had seen it through Nolan's description. The kitchen floor had been wiped down. The belongings were neatly arranged. Duke's leash no longer hung from the hook beside the door. It lay coiled on the small table beside the bed, next to an empty glass of water. Jolene sat on the edge of the bed. Holden stood, because she hadn't invited him to sit, and the room didn't have a second chair. Then she pointed to the opposite edge of the bed. He sat down. The distance between them was just enough that neither touched the other, but close enough for each to see the other's face, clearly under the small ceiling light. Jolene didn't speak right away. She looked down at her hands, palms turned upward on her thighs, hands calloused from 4 years of loading cargo and, before that, 7 years of every kind of manual work. She looked at them as though seeing something for the first time. Then she spoke, and her voice trembled. For the first time since Holden had known her, for the first time since she had sat still while a container fell 2 meters away, since she had looked at the wound on her forearm and only frowned, since she had sat beside Duke on the kitchen floor without crying, her voice trembled, just slightly, like a guitar string pulled a little too tight and beginning to vibrate at a frequency you couldn't quite hear but could feel. "Do you understand?" Holden looked at her. "That was the only thing I had." She spoke slowly, word by word, as if explaining to herself the things she had spent the past 3 days thinking about inside this room. "I don't have a family, don't have a degree, don't have a home, this place is rented, don't have anyone to call when something goes wrong. Don't have anything, only this." She lifted both hands, turned them over and back again, looking at the calluses, the small scars. "My body, my endurance, my ability to get back up every time I fall. Every time a bone broke, I was proud because it healed fast. Every time something hurt, I was proud because I could take it. I thought that was mine, the only thing that was truly mine." She lowered her hands. "And now you're telling me maybe it wasn't mine." Holden sat very still. He listened to every word, and he understood, not with reason but with some place deeper, that she wasn't angry at him. She wasn't angry at Hargrove. She wasn't angry at anyone. She was in pain. A different kind of pain. The kind of pain that comes from discovering the floor you've been standing on for 8 years may not have been the real floor, and you don't know whether, if you take another step, your foot will touch ground or fall through. Then he spoke, and he said more than Jolene had ever heard him say at any time, more than Nolan had ever heard him say at any time, more even than when he had told her the whole truth on the step the night before. He spoke slowly, clearly, each word chosen as if he were laying brick. "The chip didn't teach you to pull a man 1.5 times your size out from under a falling container. The chip didn't teach you to pick up a blind dog everyone was afraid of and take him home for 4 years. The chip didn't teach you to leave double the tip for the barista every morning even though you don't have much to spare." He stopped. "Those things aren't in any research program. There's no compound released from a 3mm chip that can teach a person to do those things." Jolene looked at him. Her eyes were red. For the first time, not red from crying, because she still didn't cry, but red because her body was reacting even though she wouldn't allow it to, because there was a limit even the best at enduring couldn't hold completely. And she was standing, right on that line. "You talk like someone who has wondered what part of himself is real." That sentence struck Holden. Not like a punch, like a needle, small, precise, and driven straight into a place no armor could cover. He didn't look away, didn't deny it. He looked at her, and after a long pause, longer than any pause he had ever allowed in any conversation, he spoke. "My mother used to say the only thing that's real is how you treat someone who has nothing to give you back. She died when I was 14. One sentence. He said one sentence, and it held more than anything he had ever said to anyone in 33 years. It held his mother's name without needing to speak it. It held loss without needing to describe it. It held the reason he had become this person, without needing to explain it. And he said it to a 27-year-old dock worker, sitting on the edge of a bed in a rented studio 4 streets from the harbor, with red eyes and calloused hands resting open on her thighs. Jolene said nothing. Holden said nothing more. They sat there. Not the way 2 people sit when they don't know what to say, but the way 2 people sit when enough has already been said. And any word added now would only thin out what had just been placed between them. Outside, the sky began to turn fully dark. The streetlight spilled in through the small window, drawing a long yellow streak across the floor, exactly where Duke used to lie. Neither of them looked at that strip of light, but both of them knew it was there. Philip Hargrove wasn't the kind of man who ran. He was 62 years old, had been fired from the pharmaceutical industry 15 years earlier for violating research ethics, had rebuilt from the ashes a program no one knew existed. Woncott operated it for nearly a decade without being discovered, and he had no intention of letting a Mafia man in Portland end everything just because one foolish deputy had exposed a trail. When Jerome Watt contacted Hargrove's people 2 days before Holden drove him out of Portland, Jerome didn't only warn them that Holden was investigating. Jerome also attached something he had kept for years as insurance for himself. Copies of the shipping transactions between Prescott Maritime's Gray Pharmaceutical Channel and Meridian Health Solutions. Every shipment, every container, every date, every waybill code that had passed through the Portland harbor under the management of the Prescott organization. Jerome sent it to Hargrove as a message. "If I go down, I don't go down alone." Hargrove received those copies and saw not a threat, but an opportunity. This evidence wasn't enough to expose the entire Prescott empire. It didn't contain information about money laundering, about the main smuggling routes, about the protection network, but it contained enough to prove that the Prescott Maritime Organization, even indirectly, had supported an illegal medical research program. And that was enough to give the FBI a legal reason to open an official investigation into Prescott's shipping system. And if the FBI started digging, they would find more, much more. Hargrove sent all the evidence to an investigative journalist in Portland, someone who specialized in organized crime and had already published 3 articles about shadowy harbor operations on the West Coast. He attached the Meridian files, the transaction lists, and enough context for the journalist to understand this wasn't fake news. Then he sat back and waited. Nolan received the information on Monday morning, from a source inside the newsroom whom Prescott had maintained a relationship with for years. The source kept it brief. An investigative article was being edited. The content involved Prescott Maritime and a medical research program, and it would go live within 72 hours. Nolan brought the news to Holden's office at 10 o'clock in the morning. He didn't talk around it, because this wasn't the time to talk around anything. Hargrove sent evidence linking Jerome and Prescott's shipping channel to a journalist. The article is being edited. The content is enough for the FBI to open an investigation if the article goes live. Holden stood beside the window. He didn't sit. "How long before the article goes up?" 72 hours. Maybe less. Holden looked down at the harbor through the glass. Number 3 pier was unloading cargo. Cranes moved. Containers lined up in rows. Everything below was still running, still steady, still normal, as if nothing was about to change. He calculated, if he attacked the journalist, the article would become a bigger scandal than the content of the article itself. If he stopped pursuing Hargrove, the man who had implanted chips into the bodies of 12 people would escape. If he did nothing, the FBI would knock on the doors of Portland Harbor within a week. 3 choices. All 3 bad. Nolan waited. He looked at Holden's back, at the way he stood motionless before the window, his hands hanging at his sides, and Nolan realized he wasn't calculating the next move. He was thinking about something else. Someone else. "Call Oaks," Holden said, still looking out the window. Then he turned around. "And tell Jolene to come see me." Nolan looked at him. In 10 years, Holden had never called anyone to come to him. He went to other people. He went down to the harbor. He drove to them. He stepped into rooms. Power went to other people, not the other way around. But today, he called Jolene to come. And Nolan understood that it wasn't because Holden was giving an order. It was because this time, he needed her here. Jolene arrived at the 12th floor office at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. She wore work clothes, loading boots, her hair tied neatly behind her. She walked through the hallway. Nolan led her into the way she would walk through a hospital corridor or a bus station, with the steps of someone who had grown used to entering places that didn't belong to her without needing anyone's permission. She didn't look around, didn't admire the building. Holden was waiting in the meeting room, the same room where Jerome had sat across from him a few days earlier. The conference table was empty, with only 2 glasses of water on it. Holden sat down. Jolene sat across from him. Nolan stepped out and closed the door. Holden told her. Briefly, without talking around it. Hargrove had struck back. The evidence linking Jerome to Prescott's shipping channel had been sent to an investigative journalist. The article would go live within 72 hours, maybe less. If the article went up, the FBI would have grounds to open an investigation into the Portland harbor. If the FBI came in, they would find more than what the article said. He told it in a flat voice, the voice of someone reporting the situation, adding no emotion, softening nothing, because she had demanded the whole truth, and he was giving her the rest of it. Jolene listened until he was done. She took a sip of water, set the glass down. "Hargrove, he's the one who put the chip in me?" "Yes. And if he gets away, he'll keep going?" Holden looked at her. "Possibly. He still has the data. Still has the server. Still has the formula. And not just you. There are at least 12 others. Jolene nodded slowly, not in agreement. In acknowledgement, the way she acknowledged everything, with the cold precision of someone used to handling terrible information without letting it swallow her. Then, she said something Holden hadn't expected. I want to testify. Holden looked at her. He didn't look away, didn't glance toward Nolan through the glass, didn't look down at the table. He looked straight at Jolene, as if he were reading a page he thought he had finished, only to discover there was one last passage he had missed. Do you understand what you're offering? His voice was softer than usual, not because it was gentle, but because it was careful. Standing before the FBI, talking about the chip, about your body, about the Meridian program, all of it will become part of a public record. You won't be invisible anymore. Your name, your medical history, everything will be in files that anyone with authority can read. Jolene looked at him, and in her eyes there was no fear, no hesitation, not even recklessness. There was something else. Clarity. The same clarity with which she had looked at him that night on the concrete step. But this time it didn't cut. It shone. I'm not doing it for you, she said, and her voice didn't tremble the way it had in the studio a few days before. Her voice was steady. Every word stood upright. I'm doing it for the 12 other people. Nobody has told what's inside them yet. Maybe they're sitting somewhere too, thinking their bodies are healthy, thinking they're lucky, thinking that endurance belongs to them, just like I thought. She stopped. If speaking up helps put Hargrove somewhere he can't do this to anyone else again, I'll speak. Whether it saves you or saves this harbor, that's your problem. Holden listened. He listened to every word, and he recognized something he had never encountered in 33 years of living among the powerful, the wealthy, the ones who held control. She wasn't bargaining. She wasn't trading. She wasn't saying, I'll do this, and you give me that. She was saying, I want to do this, and her reason had nothing to do with him. He nodded. I'll find you a lawyer, the best one money can buy. No, Holden stopped. I won't take a lawyer from you, Jolene said, and she said it gently but without yielding, in the voice of someone who had thought it through and didn't need to think again. You're the one running the organization Jerome worked for. Your lawyer will protect your interests, no matter what you say. I don't want my lawyer listening to the two of you. She looked at him straight. Dr. Oakes. I trust him. If he recommends someone, I'll meet that person. Holden sat very still. In his world, people didn't refuse help from Holden Prescott. They accepted, thanked him, and owed him. That was how the system worked. That was how power was maintained. And Jolene Ward, a 27-year-old dock worker with no family and no money, had just refused him. Not because she was afraid, not because she hated him, because of principle, because she understood that accepting a lawyer from him meant owing him, and she didn't want to owe anyone while she was trying to take control of her life back. Holden nodded, a slow, heavy nod, the kind of nod he reserved only for decisions he respected, even when they went against what he wanted. All right. Oakes referred Jolene to an independent civil rights attorney in Portland, someone who specialized in representing victims in cases of medical ethics violations. The lawyer didn't know Holden Prescott existed, didn't know what Prescott Maritime had to do with the case beyond what the press was about to publish. Jolene met the lawyer that same afternoon. She told her story from the beginning, in a flat, clear voice, leaving nothing out, adding nothing. The same way she had told Holden about Duke at the dock, the same way she had spoken about sleeping at the bus station for 3 months. Only the truth, with no emotion attached for the listener to deal with. Holden paid the legal fees through a channel neither Jolene nor the lawyer would ever know about. He didn't tell anyone, didn't tell Nolan. He simply did it, in the dark. The only way he knew how to protect someone without controlling them. 72 hours. Holden had 72 hours, and he used every one of them. On the first night, he summoned 4 financial contacts in the Prescott network to the 12th floor office. It wasn't a meeting. There was no round table, no coffee, no presentation screen. Only Holden standing before the window and 4 people sitting there, and he spoke for 6 minutes. Philip Hargrove, Meridian Health Solutions, account lists, partner lists, supply contract lists. Cut them all off. Not freeze, not pause. Cut. One of the 4 asked. For how long? Holden looked at him. Before tomorrow morning, while the 4 financial contacts began making calls, sending orders, pulling wires, closing gates, on the other side of the city. Jolene Ward sat in the waiting room of the Portland FBI office with the lawyer Oakes had recommended. She wore clean jeans and a shirt she had bought the afternoon before, her first shopping trip in months, because she didn't have any clothes suitable for sitting in a federal office, and she knew it. The lawyer sat beside her, a file on her lap. Jolene sat with her back straight, both hands resting on the table, calm in the way she was always calm. But this time, that calm carried something else, something it hadn't carried before. Intention. She wasn't calm because she was used to enduring. She was calm because she had chosen to be here. While Holden cut off Hargrove's second financial line through an intermediary bank in Nevada, Jolene stepped into the interview room and began to speak. She told it in a flat, clear voice, leaving nothing out. At 19, she had come to Portland alone. No money, no relatives. She signed up for the Meridian Health Solutions program because she needed $500 a month to survive. 8 months of routine examinations. Then the program shut down. No one ever contacted her again. And 8 years later, she found out there was a device inside her body, one she had never agreed to have implanted. It was operating. It was sending data. It was changing her from the inside. She was living evidence. While Holden cut off Hargrove's third supply contract through a pharmaceutical company in Seattle, 2 FBI agents sat across from Jolene and took notes. They didn't interrupt her. No one interrupted her. While Holden cut off Hargrove's final partner, a private laboratory outside Denver that had supplied Meridian with biological compounds for 6 years, the Portland FBI signed the order to open an official investigation into Philip Hargrove and the illegal medical research program he had been running. 48 hours after Jolene walked into the FBI office, Hargrove was arrested at his apartment outside Portland. He didn't run. Not because he was brave, but because he had nowhere left to run. Accounts closed, contracts canceled, partners cut off contact, supply lines vanished. Before the FBI knocked on his door, Holden Prescott had wiped out everything Philip Hargrove could use to rebuild. The FBI only came to collect what was left. 8 of the 12 victims in the Meridian program were found, scattered across 4 states. They were informed about the devices inside their bodies. The other 4 were still being searched for. The article went live on schedule, but the content had changed. It wasn't Mafia organization exposed. It was nearly decade-long illegal medical research program, exposed after victim comes forward to testify. Prescott Maritime was mentioned indirectly through Jerome Watt, a former employee who had been dismissed, but it wasn't the center of the story. Holden escaped. Not cleanly, but he escaped. Nolan stood in the 12th floor office after Hargrove's arrest was confirmed. He looked at Holden. "She just saved you." Holden sat behind his desk, looking out the window, looking toward the harbor where the night shift was beginning, where somewhere in loading area number 4, Jolene might be hauling cargo, or drinking coffee in the break room, or sitting alone thinking about the day. "I know. What are you going to do with that?" Holden didn't answer. 2 weeks later, after everything had settled, after the article had been swept aside by other news, after the FBI had moved the case into prosecution and Hargrove was sitting in a cell waiting for his court date, Oakes met Jolene in the harbor medical room. He sat across from her beside the same examination table she had sat on weeks earlier with the wound on her forearm, and he talked to her about the chip. "It can be removed," he said. "Microsurgery, but it has been integrated into your nervous system for 8 years. The risk is high. You may lose part of the recovery ability you're used to, part of the pain threshold you've gotten accustomed to, or your body may adapt, and you may be fine. I don't know for certain." He stopped. "Or you can keep it. It's harmless now. The server has been shut down. No one is receiving data anymore. It's just there, but it'll always be there." Jolene sat on the examination table, her legs swinging lightly, looking at Oakes. She didn't need a night to think about it. Maybe she had already finished thinking a long time ago, from the night on the concrete step, from the afternoon in the studio, when she looked at her calloused hands and wondered what was real. "Keep it." Oakes looked at her. "No matter who put it there," Jolene said. "I'm the one who has lived with it. For the past 8 years. I'm the one who woke up every morning. I'm the one who went to work. I'm the one who endured pain and stood back up. Not them." She looked straight at him. "The chip is theirs. This life is mine." Oakes nodded. He didn't write anything more in the file. There was no need. Some things were too large for paper to hold. 6 months later, the Portland harbor still operated. Ships still came into dock. Containers still lined up. Cranes still turned. The night shift still began at 10 o'clock and ended at 6 o'clock in the morning. And in loading area number 4, Jolene Ward still hauled cargo, still wore loading boots, still tied her hair neatly behind her, still worked with calloused hands that she now knew, more clearly than ever, belonged to her. On the 12th floor, Holden Prescott still sat behind the oak desk, still looked out the window toward the harbor, still ran Prescott Maritime with the control he had built over 9 years, 10 now, if the past 6 months were counted. Nothing had changed from the outside. Everything had changed from within. They weren't in love. No one said that word. There was no kiss in the rain, no confession in the night, no house key handed over, no belongings moved in. If you asked Nolan, he would say he didn't know what to call whatever was happening between Holden and Jolene. If you asked Jolene, she wouldn't answer. If you asked Holden, he would look at you in a way that would make you decide not to ask a second time. But there are things that happen without needing a name. One early autumn morning, Jolene opened the door of her studio to leave for an early shift and found a Neapolitan Mastiff puppy in front of the concrete step. He was small, but the kind of small you knew wouldn't stay small for long, with paws too large for his body, a face already full of wrinkles though he was only a few months old, drooping ears, and sleepy eyes. He wore a new leash, leather, good quality, with no name tag, no note. Nothing but the dog and the leash. Jolene stood in the doorway and looked at him. He sat below the step and looked back at her. For a long while, 2 pairs of eyes looked at each other. One pair that had seen too much, and one pair that had seen nothing yet. Then Jolene sat down on the step. The dog stood, walked over, and crawled into her lap as if he already knew that place was his. As if someone had told him this was home. This was the person. This was where he could lie down without being chased away. Jolene placed her hand on his head. Her fingers stroked along the small wrinkles, softer than Duke's wrinkles, without scars yet, without the marks of anything at all. She didn't ask who had sent him. She didn't need to ask. From that morning on, every day at 5 o'clock in the morning, Jolene ran along the Willamette River. She ran while it was still dark, while the mist hadn't lifted, while the whole city was still asleep. And at the end of the riverside path, every morning, there was a black car parked silently, lights off, engine off. No one stepped out. The car was simply there, every morning, in the right place, at the right time, from the moment she started running until she finished. Then it left. Jolene never looked toward the car, but she knew it was there. And every evening after the night shift, when Jolene stepped into the workers' break room in loading area number 4, there was a cup of coffee on the table, the exact kind she drank, the exact temperature. No sender's name, no note, just 1 cup of coffee, every night, exactly when she needed it most. Jolene never asked who placed the coffee there. She picked it up, took a sip, and smiled. A small smile, almost invisible, the kind you would miss if you weren't looking closely. But if you did look closely, you would see that it came with her eyes turned toward the window, toward the Prescott building high above, where the small light on the 12th floor was always on when the night shift began. Nolan asked Holden one evening, when he caught him calling the coffee shop near the harbor at 9:45 at night, 15 minutes before the night shift ended. "How long are you planning to keep doing this?" Holden put the phone down. "Until she tells me to stop." Nolan looked at him. "And if she never tells you?" Holden looked out the window, looked toward the harbor, toward loading area number 4, toward the riverside path where every morning he had a black car parked, unseen by some, known by all. Then good. There are people life breaks again and again. Their bodies are interfered with without anyone asking permission. People they trust betray them. The only thing they have is taken away. But there is one thing no one can implant, and no one can remove, and that is the way they choose to live after all of it. The way they choose to open the door each morning. The way they choose to sit down when a puppy runs to them. The way they choose to drink a cup of coffee without asking who sent it. Because sometimes not asking is also a way of saying, "I know, and I'm letting you stay there." That is the only extraordinary thing worth speaking of. Not physical strength, not pain tolerance, not the chip or the compound or anything science implants in someone, but the way a person, after losing everything, still chooses to believe that life can be better if they keep walking. If this story touched you, share it with someone you think needs to hear it. Press the like button, subscribe to the channel, and walk with us every day through stories like this. We'd truly love to hear what you feel from deep inside your heart. So leave a comment below and tell us what you think, what you felt, because every comment from you is the motivation that keeps us telling stories worth hearing. We wish everyone watching this video good health, a joyful life, and peace in every day. Goodbye, and see you again in the next video.